Every semester, students at SDU deliver excellent assignments on various topics. They demonstrate that they have the relevant skills needed to analyze questions of relevance to researchers and business practitioners. In 2021, students worked on an assignment that aimed to explain what motivates firms to trade with or invest in specific foreign markets. In the following, we will present findings from 5 student assignments at SDU using quantitative research methods. This assignment is provided by Annamaria, Melanie, Laura, and Linda. They analyze causal relationships between institutional environments and foreign market entry choices. Yet again, they demonstrate the relevance of economic institutional environments, yet also point to some relevance of regulatory institutions.
Welcome to this presentation that aims to demonstrate our first assignment in the International Market Analytics course at SDU. Our topic is called the causal relationships between institutional environments and foreign market entry choices. We are group 10, consisting of myself, Annamaria, as well as Linda, Laura, and Melanie. First of all, we would like to introduce our topic and the sources we work with. After, we continue with the explanation of our derived hypotheses and move on our research approach involving factor and regression analysis. Next, we are presenting the limitations we are confronted with, and last but not least, the recommendations we created based on our results. As mentioned, the purpose is to discover the causal relationships between various institutional environments and foreign market entry choices based on the articles by Holmes as well as by Bailey. In order to explore which factors influence FDI, first we analyze the findings of Holmes on 50 countries together with our dataset that has been collected for 67 countries. Our hypotheses are formed on inward FDI, meaning that FDI inflow has been used as the dependent variable. According to Holmes, inward FDI explains capital investments in a country from organizations located in other countries. These investments may take different forms, and the investing organizations may own them partially or entirely. In addition, we do not include informal institutions in this research, as their effect is dependent on the role and relative strength of formal institutions. Taking all mentioned points into account, our approach to investigate FDI and to test our hypotheses is the application of factor and regression analysis in SPSS. We place our analysis on a global level to keep a broader view on our dataset that has been collected for 216 countries and regions from Workbank, Balkan, and Freedom House. In addition, the initial number of variables we intended to work with was 42.
Moving on, we identified 3 main hypotheses, which are mainly based on Holmes et al. The first one is high regulatory controls have negative effects on inward FDI. This indicates that regulatory institutions have the authority to restrict as well as to liberate foreign operations. By doing so, they provide predictability. Thus, countries which are represented by a high amount of regulatory control mechanisms are regarded as stable environments for domestic firms. However, these regulatory constructs are leading to a significant increasement in costs. Therefore, they are not considered as facilitators towards an increased amount of inward FDI. The second hypothesis says that strong economic institutions are positively related to inward FDI. In accordance with the stated theory, we describe this hypothesis based on the following facts. Economic democratic institutions are usually facilitating investments. In addition, they do not only set organizational as well as financial frameworks, but also have the power to influence investment decisions. Therefore, we argue that well-established economic institutions positively influence market entries and set the ground for investments made by foreign venture capitalists. And lastly, our third hypothesis, democratic political institutions are positively influencing inward FDI. Based on this theory, we selected this hypothesis since democratic political institutions are designing a fundamental structure for market entries. Besides, Jensen argues that democratic institutions are significant when it comes to risk mitigation, and therefore investment risks can be mitigated by political institutions, which therefore attract inward FDI.
So for our factor analysis, we decided to cluster and select our variables based on three different institutional environments according to Holmes. We started with 42 variables that were assigned to the different institutions, the regulatory, the political, and the economic institutions. Our goal was to uncover the underlying relationships by using an exploratory factor analysis. And here on the next slides, you can see how we have pre-assigned the variables to the different institutions to create the factors with. For our model, we tried several attempts to find the best fitting model, but we either had a good factor analysis and a bad regression, or the other way around. For example, we had a model with a good factor analysis with high MSA scores and with a high KMO. But for this model, the regression analysis was very bad, with a very low R-square of 0.07 and a significance level of over 1. So therefore, we decided to proceed with a different model that had a moderate factor analysis, but a very good regression analysis. Because with that, we can explain the causal relationship between FDI and the institutional environments better, and because the factors are backed up by the theory. For the correlation matrix, for our factor analysis, we decided to go with a moderate model, as mentioned before. The KMO score here is above 0.7, which is moderately okay. But according to the Bartlett's test, we can reject the zero hypothesis here, that the variables are uncorrelated, which means that this dataset is appropriate for a factor analysis. The variables do not always have an adequate score in the anti-image correlation, but this could be due to the heterogeneity of the data. For our factors, we first try to create factors in an exploratory approach, which created 4 factors that had an explanatory power of 87%. But as these factors did not match the expected outcome based on this theory, we created factors in a confirmatory approach that could explain 67% of the variance. The factors created are political institutions, economic institutions, and regulatory institutions. And with that, we created the regression analysis.
So before starting the regression analysis, we firstly put our hypothesis into a formula in order to explain the relationship that occur between the dependent variable, so the FDI, and the 3 independent factors that we created. So the regulatory control, economic institution, and democratic political institution. According to our analysis, the R-square indicate that 81.1% of the inward FDI can be explained by our 3 predictors. We can also conclude that the model explains a significant part in the variation of inward FDI, since the F-test shows significance of the 1% level, which means we can reject the zero hypothesis, which means that there is the linear relationship between all our independent variables combined and the inward FDI. Next, looking at the strength and the direction of the relationship, instead we can see that the factor that influence most the FDI would be the economic institution, followed by the regulatory institution, which, as we can observe from our data, only partially influence it. On the other hand, the political institution is the factor which least influences the FDI. The variance inflation factor, which measure the multicollinearity, is below 5 for all our predictors, which indicates that there is no issue with the multicollinearity, and then the information is not redundant. Looking at the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test of normality and at the histogram, we can reject the null hypothesis of normal distribution, which means that we have a non-constant variance of residual. It is not possible to further improve the model due to data limitation.
So based on our factor and regression analysis, we can partly confirm our hypothesis. Starting off with our first hypothesis, we can conclude that it is only partly valid. Thus, regulatory controls represent an intermediate influence on FDI. Nevertheless, they need to be considered carefully. Our second hypothesis can be confirmed since we identified a significant relation between strong economic institutions and inward FDI. In contrast, based on our model, we cannot confirm a relation between democratic political institutions and inward FDI, and therefore we reject our third hypothesis. During the research, we faced the following limitations. First, due to the missing data, we were not able to use all independent variables as we had planned initially. It was also not possible to include 216 countries and regions in our analysis in view of the lack of data. As a result of the limited time and data availability, we could not derive and test more hypotheses.
Based on our analysis, we also suggest several recommendations. So for companies, we identified the following. Based on our findings, we advise managers to deeply evaluate foreign market entries and investments. It is crucial to determine the direction of economic institutions in the targeted country. Also, regulatory control mechanisms should be fostered by not only based on domestic production in order to avoid uncertainty and to enter into a comparable, stable environment which is financially beneficial. For countries and regions, we developed the following advice. Firstly, countries and regions need to assess whether and in which dimension they want to attract foreign investments. Next, it is significant to adapt the country's regulatory controls towards FDIs in order to facilitate foreign market entries. Lastly, economic institutions are highly related to foreign market entries. Nevertheless, most countries aim for these strong economic institutions in connection, but also irregardless of FDIs. Lastly, for future research, we suggest to deeply consider relevant countries as well as relevant variables. Furthermore, countries should be clustered in regard to their institutional tendencies and in order to make clear statements in regard to the different institutional influences. Moreover, informal institutions might be crucial for future research as well. In addition, we also advise future researchers to take Hofstede's cultural dimensions into consideration. So that was our presentation. Thanks for your attention, and on the next slide we'll show you our references.
I hope you enjoyed watching. Feel free to get in touch in the case of any questions.